Hey guys, today we're going into a part of medieval life that sounds simple at first. Food going bad. But the strange thing is that spoiled food was not just a kitchen problem. It shaped when people traveled, what they could eat, how towns smelled, why fasting seasons mattered, why salt was precious, and why even a full pantry could feel strangely fragile. Before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, liking the video is a quiet way to support it. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, intelligent history stories for the evening. To understand medieval food, we have to begin with a world that had almost no margin for freshness. For most people in medieval Europe, food was not something that waited patiently. It was alive with time. Grain could grow damp. Milk could sour before the day was over. Meat could turn unsafe in warm weather with surprising speed. Fish, unless salted or dried almost immediately, became a race against the air. Fruit softened, split, bruised, attracted insects, and vanished from usefulness almost as soon as it reached ripeness. Even bread, that most basic and comforting food, could harden, mold, or become stale depending on the weather, the flour, the oven, and the storage room. Modern viewers often imagine medieval food through feasts, trenchers, roasted meat, heavy ale, and tables lit by candlelight. There is some truth in that image, but it is only the polished edge of a much larger reality. The daily question was not simply, what shall we eat? It was, what can still be eaten? What can be saved? What must be used today? What has already begun to change? In a world without refrigeration, sealed industrial packaging, modern transport, food safety science, and reliable year-round supply chains, every meal existed inside a quiet countdown. This does not mean medieval people were careless. In many ways, they were intensely practical. They understood smell, texture, season, weather, fermentation, smoke, drying, salting, boiling, and the difference between food that was merely strong-tasting and food that had truly turned dangerous. They did not speak in the language of microbes, but they lived close enough to food to know that warmth, moisture, flies, damp cellars, bad barrels, and long journeys could ruin what had taken months to grow. The real story is not that medieval people failed to preserve food. It is that they were preserving food constantly with every tool their world could give them, and still the problem never went away. The first reason food spoiled so easily was not mysterious at all. It was temperature. Most medieval homes had no controlled cool storage. A stone cellar could help, especially in wealthier houses, monasteries, castles, or urban buildings with deeper foundations, but a cellar was not a refrigerator. It depended on the soil, the season, the thickness of the walls, the local climate, and whether the space was dry enough to keep food from becoming damp. In winter, preservation was easier. In summer, everything became more urgent. A piece of meat that might keep for a short time in cold weather could become questionable much faster when the air turned warm and heavy. That is why the slaughtering of animals was often tied to season. A pig killed in late autumn could be salted, smoked, rendered, and stretched into the colder months. This timing made sense. After harvest, there might be more feed available for a while, but keeping too many animals through winter was expensive. They consumed food people could not spare. So animals were often slaughtered when the weather itself became part of the preservation system. Cold air was not just comfort. It was infrastructure. But even cold weather had limits. Medieval preservation was not a single technique. It was a whole pattern of decisions. Meat could be salted heavily, but salt was valuable and unevenly available. It had to be mined, evaporated, transported, taxed, sold, and guarded as a commodity. Fish could be dried or smoked, but damp weather could interfere. Grain could keep for months or even years if properly dried and stored, But one leak in a roof, one badly ventilated granary, one infestation, or one damp harvest could turn security into anxiety. Cheese could preserve milk, but cheese itself had to be watched, turned, protected, aged, and defended from animals, insects, and mold that was not always welcome. So when we ask why medieval food spoiled so easily, the answer begins with a simple truth. Food was not protected from the world. It was inside the world. It sat in wooden bins, clay pots, woven baskets, cloth sacks, barrels, crocks, chests, rafters, cellars, lofts, smokehouses, and market stalls. It breathed the same air as the household. It absorbed damp from walls, smoke from fires, smells from animals, and heat from crowded rooms. It was handled by many hands. It traveled by cart, boat, pack animal, and foot. It waited in markets exposed to weather. And every stage between field and mouth gave spoilage another chance. Bread offers one of the clearest examples because it was so ordinary. In many parts of medieval Europe, bread was the foundation of the diet. Yet bread was also vulnerable. Fine white bread made from wheat was more associated with wealth, while darker breads made from rye, barley, oats, mixed grains, or maslin were more common among ordinary people, depending on region and crop conditions. Bread could be baked at home, but in many towns and villages, ovens were communal or controlled by lords, monasteries, or professional bakers. That meant baking happened in rhythms, not always exactly when a household wished. Fresh bread was desirable, but it did not remain fresh. Hard bread was not necessarily wasted. It could be dipped in broth, soaked in ale, used as a trencher, broken into pottage, or softened with liquid. Staleness was manageable. Mold was a different matter. Damp storage could make bread unsafe or unpleasant, especially when loaves were kept too long or stored in close, humid spaces. The medieval household therefore had to distinguish between food that was no longer pleasant and food that was no longer fit. That line was not always clean. Pottage, the slow-cooked mixture of grains, vegetables, herbs, legumes, and sometimes meat scraps or fat, was another answer to the problem. It was flexible, forgiving, and suited to ingredients that needed using before they failed. A cabbage leaf slightly tired from storage, a handful of peas, some leeks, oats, old bread, a bone, a little salted meat, or the last usable vegetables from a garden could become part of the pot. This was not simply poverty food in the modern dismissive sense. It was a preservation strategy disguised as a meal. It allowed households to keep food moving before spoilage could claim it. Yet the pot itself had its own risks. A stew kept warm, reheated, stretched, and added to over time could remain useful, but it depended on heat, cleanliness by the standards of the period, and careful judgment. Boiling could make many foods safer, which is one reason cooked dishes mattered so much. But cooking did not magically reset time forever. Once a dish cooled, the same old problem returned. The medieval kitchen lived in a cycle of heating, eating, saving, reheating, and deciding. Milk may have been one of the most unforgiving foods of all. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather, and many adults did not consume it in the way modern people do. Turning milk into butter, cheese, curds, or other processed forms made it more useful and longer lasting. This is one of those details that can feel small until we realize what it means. Medieval dairy culture was not just about taste. It was about survival through transformation. A cow or goat produced something perishable, and the household had to convert that perishability into something that could travel through time. Cheese, however, was not one simple food. Some cheeses were soft and short-lived. Others were harder and better suited to storage. Monasteries, rural estates, and household dairies developed routines around pressing, salting, aging, and storing. The work required knowledge passed through repetition. Too much moisture could ruin the result. Too little salt could invite trouble. Poor storage could waste days or weeks of labor. The medieval dairy was therefore a place of quiet pressure. A good cheese was not just food. It was time captured successfully. Meat carried even greater tension because it represented wealth, labor, status, and loss all at once. An animal was not only meat. It was traction, milk, wool, breeding value, manure, or future security. To slaughter it was to make a decision that could not be undone. Once killed, the clock accelerated. Large animals created more meat than most households could immediately eat, which meant preservation had to begin quickly. Salting, smoking, drying, potting in fat, making sausages, and sharing or selling portions all helped. But none of these methods were effortless, and none made food immortal. Salted meat, in particular, reveals the hidden cost of preservation. To modern ears, salting sounds simple, but salt changed the taste, texture, and use of meat. It required soaking, boiling, or balancing with other foods. Could be expensive, could be unevenly applied, could fail if the meat was not properly prepared or stored. And heavily salted food affected the rest of the diet, increasing the need for liquids and shaping cooking habits. Preservation solved one problem by creating a chain of smaller ones. This is one reason spices became surrounded by so many myths in later imagination. A common modern claim says medieval people used spices to hide rotten meat. That version is too simple and often misleading. Spices were expensive, associated with status, trade, medicine, taste, and display. Wealthy households did use spices heavily, but not because they were happily disguising spoiled food. Serving rotten meat to powerful guests would have been risky, embarrassing, and wasteful. The deeper truth is more interesting. Medieval cooking often used strong flavors in a world where preservation methods already changed food. Salted meat, dried fish, aged cheese, ale, vinegar, mustard, herbs, verjuice, onions, garlic, and spices all belong to a flavor world shaped by storage, season, class, and trade. In other words, medieval food did not spoil easily because people lacked intelligence. It spoiled easily because the entire material world was against permanence. Moisture entered, heat rose, air circulated, insects found openings. Rats and mice exploited weakness. Barrels leaked. Roofs failed. Roads delayed carts. Boats waited on weather. Markets depended on timing. Harvests depended on sunlight and rain arriving in the right order. A single broken link could turn abundance into waste. And abundance was often brief. Harvest season could create the illusion of plenty, but much of medieval life was about carrying that plenty forward into scarcity. Grain had to last. Fruit had to be dried, cooked, pressed, or eaten quickly. Grapes became wine where climate allowed. Apples and pears might be stored, dried, or turned into drink. Vegetables could be kept in earth clamps, pits, cellars, gardens, or preserved in simple ways, but not with modern certainty. Nuts could keep if dry. Legumes offered stability. Honey could last remarkably well. Vinegar was valuable. Ale, beer, cider, and wine were not only drinks but ways of making agricultural products safer, more durable, and socially useful. The medieval calendar therefore had a taste. Late summer and autumn were not like late winter. The food changed because the world changed. Freshness was seasonal, and seasonality was not a lifestyle choice. It was a boundary. People ate what the land, weather, and storage allowed. For peasants, this could mean long periods of monotony. For the wealthy, it meant a more varied table, but even wealth could not fully escape time. Nobles could command supplies, maintain larger storage, hire cooks, buy spices, preserve meats, and draw rents in kind. But their kitchens still had to manage deliveries, spoilage, storage rooms, live animals, servants, fuel, and the unpredictable quality of what arrived. Towns added another layer of difficulty. In the countryside, a household might be closer to production. Gardens, animals, fields, orchards, woods, streams. In towns, food often had to move through markets. Movement gave people access to variety, but it also increased vulnerability. Fish brought inland had to be salted, dried, smoked, or sold quickly. Meat in urban stalls had to be inspected, at least in better regulated towns, because bad food threatened not only one household but public order. Bread weight, ale quality, and meat sales became matters of regulation because food was political. A hungry town could become unstable. A cheated customer could become angry. A spoiled market could damage trust. Medieval authorities understood this in practical ways. They might not have known bacteria, but they knew fraud, stench, visible decay, short wait, watered ale, diseased animals, and sellers who tried to pass off poor goods as sound. Town officials, guilds, and market inspectors could punish bad practice, though enforcement varied greatly. This tells us something important. Food spoilage was not only a private inconvenience. It was a public concern. The quality of bread, ale, meat, and fish mattered to the reputation of a town and the peace of its streets. But regulation could not remove the basic problem. Imagine a fishmonger on a warm day, with fish that had already traveled from water to boat, from boat to shore, from shore to cart or basket, and then into a crowded market. Every hour mattered. A buyer had to judge with eyes and nose. A seller had to move stock before it failed. A town official had to decide what crossed the line. The same fish that was valuable in the morning could become suspicious by evening. This is why preservation industries around fish became so important. Herring, cod, and other fish could be salted or dried at scale, feeding inland populations, armies, towns, monasteries, and fasting Christians who could not always eat meat. The religious calendar deepened the pressure. Medieval Christianity shaped eating habits through fasting days, Lent, vigils, and local rules that restricted meat at certain times. Fish became essential not merely because people liked it, but because it fit religious practice. That demand encouraged trade and preservation. Dried and salted fish could travel farther than fresh fish, though it too could be badly cured, poorly stored, or unpleasant if mishandled. A piece of dried fish was a solution to spoilage, but also a reminder of the problem it was trying to defeat. Here we begin to see the central irony. The foods that lasted longest were often the foods most altered from their fresh state. Salted fish, smoked meat, hard cheese, dried peas, beans, grain, ale, vinegar, pickled items, dried fruit, and hard bread all belonged to a world where survival required transformation. Freshness was precious because it was temporary. The medieval table was therefore divided between the immediate and the preserved, the seasonal and the stored, the soft and the hardened, the fragrant and the heavily salted, the newly baked and the soaked back into usefulness. Even the architecture of daily life reflected this. A house with a cool storage space had an advantage. A monastery with organized cellars, barns, fish ponds, dairies, gardens, and disciplined labor could manage food more systematically. A castle could hold stores for status and siege, but large stores required constant supervision. Grain had to be protected from damp and pests. Barrels had to be checked. Meat had to be hung safely. Cheese had to be watched. Servants had to know which items should be used first. A pantry was not a passive room. It was a place where time was being negotiated. For poorer households, the negotiation was harsher. There was less space, less equipment, less salt, less fuel, less access to controlled storage, and less ability to absorb loss. If food spoiled, it was not merely disappointing. It could mean hunger. This made people careful, inventive, and often conservative in their habits. They did not waste easily. Scraps became stock. Bones flavored broth. Stale bread found another use. Sour milk could become something else if caught early enough. Overripe fruit might be cooked. Greens were gathered when available. The boundary between thrift and risk was thin, and it had to be walked every day. Fuel itself mattered more than we might expect. Cooking, boiling, smoking, drying, and baking all required energy. Wood, charcoal, peat, brushwood, or other fuels had to be gathered, bought, managed, and protected. A household with limited fuel could not simply boil everything endlessly or smoke meat whenever it wished. Preservation depended on resources beyond the food itself. To keep food safe, one needed containers, labor, space, salt, fuel, time, knowledge, and suitable weather. Remove any one of those and spoilage became more likely. Containers were another quiet weakness. Modern packaging is so effective that we barely notice it. Medieval containers were useful but imperfect. Wooden barrels could be excellent, but they required skilled coopering and could leak or taint contents if badly made or poorly cleaned. Ceramic pots could store liquids and fats, but they broke. Cloth sacks breathed and absorbed damp. Baskets were light but open. Leather, wood, wax, pitch, and cloth all had roles, but none created the sealed, sterile world modern consumers expect. Food was always in contact with materials that had histories of their own. And then there were animals. Not only the animals meant for food, but the unwanted ones. Mice, rats, weevils, flies, beetles, dogs, cats, pigs, chickens, and other creatures moved through the same human environments. A granary was attractive. A kitchen was attractive. A market was attractive. Keeping food away from animals required elevation, storage design, watchfulness, traps, cats, sealed bins, and luck. Infestation did not always destroy everything at once. Sometimes it slowly reduced quality, turning a secure store into a hidden disappointment. This slow uncertainty may be one of the hardest things for a modern listener to imagine. Today, many people discover food has spoiled when a date on a package has passed, or when a refrigerator fails, or when something is forgotten too long. In the medieval world, uncertainty was built into the entire food system. The question was not occasional. It was daily. Is the grain dry enough? Is the ale sound? Is the cheese aging properly? Is the salted meat keeping? Is the fish too far gone? Is the cellar too damp? Should this be eaten now before it is lost? Can this be saved with cooking? Can this be traded before it fails? That constant judgment shaped the medieval senses. Smell mattered. Texture mattered. Color mattered. The soundness of a barrel, the dryness of a sack, the firmness of a fruit, the behavior of a loaf, the surface of a cheese, the clarity of ale, the smell of meat at the stall. All of these were forms of knowledge. Medieval people were not reading labels. They were reading materials. But this kind of knowledge had limits. Some dangers could not be detected easily. Grain spoiled by damp could carry hidden risks. Bad storage could create problems before obvious signs appeared. Foodborne illness existed even when people lacked the modern vocabulary for it. The medieval relationship with spoiled food was therefore practical but imperfect. People knew a great deal from experience, but experience could not reveal everything. This is where trust in suppliers, household reputation, local regulation, and repeated custom became important. A reliable baker, brewer, butcher, dairyman, or fish seller was valuable because food quality was partly a matter of trust. The brewer's work shows this especially well. Ale and beer were central in many medieval communities, and brewing was often done domestically, especially by women in many regions, before becoming more commercialized in towns. Grain, water, yeast activity, herbs or hops depending on place and period, heat, timing, and vessels all had to be managed. A drink could sour, weaken, spoil, or be adulterated. Yet brewing also helped make grain and water into something more stable and socially meaningful. Again, preservation and risk sat side by side. Water itself complicates the story. It is too simple to say medieval people never drank water, but it is also true that ale, beer, wine, and cider were often important daily beverages where available. They provided calories, flavor, and in many cases a more reliable drink than questionable water sources, though quality varied. The key point is not the old myth that everyone was drunk all the time. It is that liquid safety, like food safety, depended on place, treatment, storage, and habit. A weak ale might be ordinary, nourishing, and safer in some contexts, while still capable of going bad if poorly made or kept. As we move deeper into the medieval food world, the pattern becomes clearer. Spoilage was not a single failure. It was the pressure behind nearly every success. It explains why salt mattered so much, why smokehouses mattered, why cellars mattered, why markets needed rules, why religious food systems shaped trade, why harvest time had urgency, why winter slaughter made sense, why pottage was practical, why hard cheese was valuable, and why wealth could soften but not erase the limits of nature. And the next layer of the story takes us from the household pantry into the wider medieval economy, where keeping food from spoiling was not just a domestic skill, but a business, a tax system, a religious necessity, and sometimes a matter of survival for entire towns. That wider economy began with a simple fact that every medieval household understood. Even if they never described it in grand terms, food had to move before it changed. A fish caught on a coast, a sack of grain harvested in a village, a barrel of ale brewed in a town, a wheel of cheese pressed in a dairy, or a side of pork packed in salt all entered a race against distance, weather, handling, and time. The farther food traveled, the more skill was required to keep it useful. The more people depended on food from beyond their own fields, the more spoilage became not only a private worry, but a problem of trade. In the early morning, when market towns began to stir, this pressure was already visible. Cellars arrived before the day warmed too much. Carts creaked over rutted roads. Baskets were lifted down. Cloths were folded back. Animals were tethered or driven toward slaughter. Bakers carried loaves that still held the memory of the oven. Fishmongers set out goods that had to be inspected quickly, and buyers made their judgments with the seriousness of people who knew that a bad choice might cost more than money. A medieval market was not only a place of abundance. It was a place where freshness was being measured in public. This is one reason medieval towns developed rules around food. Bread, ale, meat, fish, and other staples were too important to be left entirely to chance. The assize of bread and ale in England, for example, tied the price and weight of bread to the cost of grain and regulated the quality of ale. But beneath the legal wording was a practical anxiety. If bread was underweight, people were cheated. If ale was weak or spoiled, trust broke down. If meat unfit for sale appeared in the market, the danger was not only illness but disorder. Food was one of the places where government touched ordinary life most directly. These regulations did not create a clean or modern food system. Enforcement could be uneven. Corruption existed. Sellers could be careless or desperate. Officials might be strict one week and absent the next. But the existence of such rules tells us that medieval people were not indifferent to quality. They understood that public food required public oversight. A town that tolerated rotten meat, false weights, sour ale, or fraudulent bread was a town inviting anger. The ordinary meal was connected to civic stability, but regulation had to work within the limits of the road. Medieval roads were often slow, seasonal, and unpredictable. In dry weather, a cart might pass with difficulty. In rain, a road could become deep mud. Bridges could fail. Rivers could flood. Snow could close routes. Bandits or toll collectors could slow traffic. A delay of one day might be irritating for pottery or cloth. For fresh food, it could be disastrous. A basket of fruit, a load of fresh fish, or a carcass meant for sale did not wait politely while wheels were repaired. Water transport was often better, and in many places it formed the quiet backbone of food movement. Rivers, canals where they existed, estuaries, and coastal routes could carry heavier loads more efficiently than carts. Grain, wine, salt fish, and other goods moved by boat whenever geography allowed. But boats had their own uncertainties. Wind, tide, river level, storms, and harbor delays shaped trade. A shipment could arrive early, late, damaged, damp, or not at all. Even in good conditions, food in barrels, sacks, and baskets was still vulnerable to water, heat, and rough handling. This is why preservation industries became so important. They were not luxuries on the edge of the food system. They were the technologies that made distance possible. Salted fish could feed people far from the sea. Dried peas and beans could be carried and stored. Grain could become flour, bread, ale, or porridge, depending on need. Meat could be salted, smoked, or rendered into fat. Milk could become cheese. Grapes could become wine. Apples could become cider. The medieval food economy was, in many ways, an economy of transformation. And yet, transformation always involved compromise. The preserved food that survived distance was not the same as fresh food. Salted fish could be tough, strong, and demanding to prepare. Salted meat could dominate a dish. Hard cheese might be valuable but not delicate. Dried legumes required time, water, and fuel. Grain had to be milled, and milling itself was often controlled by lordly rights or urban arrangements. Preservation increased survival, but it did not remove dependence. It shifted the burden from speed to labor, fuel, tools, and taste. Salt, more than almost anything else, reveals how closely food preservation was tied to power. To a modern kitchen, salt is cheap and ordinary. In medieval Europe, it was essential and often strategically important. It came from salt pans, mines, coastal evaporation, brine springs, and trade networks. Could be taxed. Could enrich regions. It could shape the prosperity of towns. A community with reliable access to salt could preserve meat and fish more effectively. A community without it had fewer options, especially when faced with seasonal abundance that could not be eaten immediately. The value of salt was not only economic. It was temporal. Salt bought time. It stretched a slaughtered animal beyond the day of killing. It allowed fish to travel inland. It gave armies, monasteries, ships, and towns a way to hold food against hunger. But because it was valuable, it also exposed inequality. Wealthier households could afford more secure preservation. Poorer households had to use less, rely more on immediate consumption, or depend on foods that stored more naturally, such as grain and legumes. In this way, spoilage was not experienced equally. The same warm summer day could be merely inconvenient for a wealthy household and deeply threatening for a poor one. Fish offers one of the clearest examples of this preserved economy. Medieval Christian fasting rules created a vast demand for fish, especially on days when meat was restricted. But most people did not live beside rich fishing grounds. The solution required catching, cleaning, salting, drying, smoking, packing, shipping, selling, and cooking. Herring from the North Sea and Baltic networks, cod from northern waters, freshwater fish from ponds and rivers, eels from marshes and waterways, and local catches all entered different systems of use. Some were eaten fresh near where they were caught. Others became commodities hardened by preservation. For monasteries and religious houses, fish could be especially important. Many monasteries developed fish ponds, not only as signs of wealth or order, but as practical answers to diet and season. A fish pond was a kind of living pantry. Unlike a barrel of salted fish, fish kept alive in water had not yet entered the same race against decay. This is an important reversal. Sometimes the best way to preserve food was not to preserve it after death, but to delay death itself. Livestock in a field, fish in a pond, chickens in a yard, and fruit still hanging on a tree all represented food stored in living form. But living storage came with its own costs. Animals had to be fed, protected, bred, and watched. Fish ponds required maintenance. Disease could spread. Predators could intervene. Weather could damage supply. Keeping food alive was not effortless. It was simply another way of managing time. Medieval people did not have one solution to spoilage. They had overlapping solutions, each imperfect, each suited to a particular season, class, landscape, and household. Grain stood at the center because, compared with meat, milk, fish, and fruit, it could be remarkably durable if handled well. But that phrase, if handled well, carries much of the story. Grain had to be harvested at the right moment, dried properly, threshed, winnowed, stored above damp, guarded from pests, and protected from fire. A granary looked like security, but it was also a place of danger. Damp could creep in silently. Rodents could multiply. Insects could feed unseen. Mold could spread. A harvest that appeared generous could lose value if storage failed. This made the harvest season both hopeful and anxious. Fields cut and gathered did not automatically become food security. The grain still had to survive its passage into storage. Weather at harvest mattered intensely. Too much rain could delay cutting or make drying difficult. Damp grain was a threat to the future. Every community understood that the months after harvest were not just a time of celebration, but a time of assessment. How much had been gathered? How dry was it? How much would be owed as rent or tithe? How much would remain? How long could it last? How safely could it be stored? The tithe barn, the manorial granary, the peasant's chest or bin, and the merchant's warehouse all belonged to the same world of guarded food. They were places where the future could be seen in sacks and heaps. But they were also places where inequality was made visible. A lord's granary might stand full while poorer households worried about winter. A monastery might store carefully while laborers depended on wages and market prices. A merchant might profit from scarcity. Spoilage, shortage, and storage were never only natural facts. They were social facts as well. And sometimes what spoiled was not the food itself but the balance between people and supply. A bad harvest could be worsened by poor storage. A war could interrupt trade. A disease among animals could reduce meat and dairy. A wet year could damage grain. A harsh winter could consume fodder. A hot summer could ruin perishables faster. Local abundance could exist beside nearby hunger if roads failed, prices rose, or merchants chose profit over relief. Medieval food insecurity was rarely caused by one factor. It was usually a chain. This is where the story of spoilage becomes more uncomfortable. We often think of bad food as a small domestic problem. A loaf gone moldy, milk gone sour, meat gone off. But in the medieval world, spoilage sat close to famine. Not because every spoiled item caused disaster, but because preserved food was the bridge between plenty and hunger. When that bridge weakened, people could find themselves in danger even if fields had once been productive. The failure of storage could turn yesterday's abundance into tomorrow's fear. At the same time, medieval people developed remarkable systems to reduce that fear. Smoking meat and fish, for example, did more than add flavor. Smoke helped dry the surface, discourage insects, and slow decay. A smokehouse or smoky rafters above a hearth could turn the ordinary fire into part of the preservation system. But smoke required fuel, space, and knowledge. Too little drying and the food remained vulnerable. Too much heat and it cooked or hardened badly. The work had to be watched. Drying was similarly powerful. In the right climate, fruit, fish, meat, herbs, and other foods could be dried for storage. But drying depended on air, sun, wind, protection from rain, and protection from animals. A sudden damp spell could ruin progress. A badly dried food could appear preserved while still carrying hidden moisture. Again, the technique was simple in principle but demanding in practice. Medieval preservation often looked easy only when described after it succeeded. Pickling and souring also mattered. Vinegar, brine, fermentation, and acidic environments could help keep certain foods usable. Cabbage, vegetables, fruits, sauces, and dairy products could all be shaped by controlled sourness. Fermentation is one of the oldest human alliances with invisible life, though medieval people did not understand it in modern scientific terms. They knew patterns. They knew that certain processes, vessels, temperatures, and timings produced desirable results, while others produced failure. The boundary between fermentation and spoilage was often a boundary of control. This boundary is one of the most fascinating parts of medieval food. Many foods people valued were, in a sense, managed decay. Cheese, ale, wine, vinegar, sourdough, cured meat, fermented sauces, and aged products all depended on transformation. The medieval kitchen did not simply fight change. It tried to guide change. The same world that made food spoil quickly also made food complex. A fresh ingredient might be fragile, but a transformed ingredient could become durable, flavorful, and valuable. The danger was that transformation could slip out of human control. That is why smell was not always a sign of rejection. Strong smells were part of many preserved foods. Aged cheese, salted fish, fermenting ale, vinegar, smoke, garlic, onions, mustard, herbs, and animal fats all created an intense sensory world. Modern people, accustomed to chilled freshness and sealed packaging, may imagine medieval food as uniformly foul or rotten. That is not fair, but it was certainly more variable, more pungent, and more directly connected to process. People lived among the smells of preservation because preservation was life. The kitchen itself was not the clean, separate, tiled space many modern homes know. In many households, cooking happened around a central hearth or in a working room shared with other domestic activities. Smoke darkened beams. Animals might be close by or even inside at certain times and places. Water had to be carried. Waste had to be removed. Utensils were wood, iron, ceramic, horn, leather, or cloth. Cleanliness existed, but not in the modern sanitized sense. A household could be orderly and still full of smoke, ash, damp, animals, insects, and human traffic. In wealthier households, kitchens could be large, specialized, and busy, with separate spaces for baking, brewing, storage, pastry, roasting, and washing. But scale brought its own danger. Feeding a noble household required large quantities moving through many hands. Servants had to track what was fresh, what was preserved, what was for immediate use, what was for the high table, what was for lower servants, what could be reused, and what should not be served. A feast required planning not only for display, but for timing. Food had to arrive at the table before heat, texture, and safety failed. Feasting can make medieval food seem abundant and glamorous, but even a feast was haunted by perishability. Fresh meat had to be slaughtered or delivered. Fish had to be secured. Sauces had to be prepared. Bread had to be baked. Ale and wine had to be ready. Spices had to be available. Dishes had to be timed around fire, labor, and service. A wealthy lord could command a magnificent meal, but behind that meal stood a logistical struggle. The more impressive the table, the more invisible labor had been required to defeat time for a few hours. There is a quiet irony here. Medieval elites often used food to display power, Yet the very need to display abundance revealed how precarious food could be. To serve fresh fish inland, exotic spices, white bread, tender meats, sweet wines, or elaborate dishes was to show not only wealth, but access to networks that could overcome distance and decay. Luxury was partly the ability to make fragile things appear effortless. But they were not effortless. They were expensive because they were difficult. For ordinary people, the more important luxury may have been not extravagance, but reliability. A household that had dry grain, sound ale, usable fat, onions, legumes, a little cheese, perhaps some salted meat, and access to fuel possessed a kind of quiet security. The meals might seem plain, but plainness could be stable. A richly sauced dish might impress a guest, but a well-kept store carried a family through winter. Medieval food values were therefore shaped by a tension between delight and endurance. This tension appeared sharply in times of scarcity. When supplies ran low, people stretched foods further. Bread might contain mixed grains or lower-quality ingredients. Pottage might become thinner. Meat might disappear from the pot. Spoiled or borderline food might be considered more carefully because hunger changed the calculation of risk. The same item rejected in a good year might be used in a bad one. This is one of the harsher truths of pre-modern food systems. Food safety choices were shaped by necessity. People did not always eat risky food because they did not know better. Sometimes they ate it because the alternative was worse. That fact should make us cautious about judging the past too quickly. Medieval people were not modern consumers making relaxed choices among refrigerated options. They were living inside constraints. Their knowledge was practical, inherited, and often sharp. Their mistakes could be costly. Their successes were often quiet and repetitive. Every loaf stored well, every cheese aged soundly, every barrel that held, every grain sack kept dry, every fish properly salted, every winter supply stretched into spring. These were small victories against loss. Spring, in many ways, was the most revealing season. It is easy to imagine winter as the hardest time, and often it was. But late winter and early spring could be more dangerous because stores had been drawn down. Grain might be low. Preserved meats might be nearly gone. Fresh vegetables were not yet abundant. Animals that survived winter might be lean. Milk production depended on cycles of birth and pasture. This period, sometimes called the Hungry Gap, exposed the limits of preservation. Food had not spoiled all at once. It had simply been consumed, reduced, weakened, or lost over months. The year itself had a difficult seam. At that seam, the first greens, the return of better pasture, the growth of herbs, the availability of eggs, and the gradual renewal of fresh foods mattered deeply. Freshness after scarcity was not a culinary preference. It was relief, but fresh food also brought back the old race. As the year warmed, abundance returned, and with it came the need to process, eat, sell, dry, brew, churn, salt, smoke, and store before warmth and insects claimed the surplus. The cycle did not end. It simply changed tempo. Medieval cooks and household managers therefore lived by rhythms that modern kitchens have largely softened. They knew the urgent tasks of slaughter season, the caution of damp harvests, the opportunity of fruit time, the pressure of brewing, the careful work of dairying, and the importance of buying at the right moment in the market. Their food knowledge was seasonal memory. A recipe was not only a set of instructions. It was often an answer to timing. This helps explain why medieval cookery can sometimes seem imprecise to modern readers. Many recipes assume that the cook already understands the ingredients, the fire, the texture, and the moment of readiness. Exact temperatures and standardized timings were less useful in kitchens where ovens, hearths, vessels, and ingredients varied so much. A cook judged by sight, smell, touch, thickness, and experience. This sensory skill was especially important when ingredients might differ in freshness. The same instruction could produce a different result depending on the age of the meat, the dryness of the bread, the saltiness of the fish, or the sharpness of the vinegar. Even medicine and food were not fully separate in medieval thinking. Digestion, humoral balance, season, age, and temperament were often believed to matter. Foods were classified in terms of qualities such as hot, cold, moist, and dry, and physicians and educated households might think carefully about how foods affected the body. Some of these ideas do not match modern science, but they shaped real choices. Preservation methods also altered these perceived qualities. Salted, dried, smoked, aged, or sour foods were not merely practical. They were understood within a wider theory of bodily balance. This does not mean every peasant was consulting medical texts before dinner. Most people ate according to access, labor, custom, and hunger. But elite and monastic food culture often connected diet to morality, health, order, and discipline. Fasting was spiritual, but it was also material. Feast days and fast days structured demand. Monastic rules shaped storage. Medical advice influenced elite tables. The result was a food world where spoilage, preservation, religion, class, and health all overlapped. One particularly revealing institution was the monastery. A well-run monastery could be a marvel of organized food management. Gardens for herbs and vegetables, orchards, fish ponds, dairies, bakehouses, brewhouses, cellars, granaries, kitchens, refectories, and systems of almsgiving. Monastic communities needed regular food not only for monks or nuns, but for guests, servants, workers, and the poor who might receive charity. Their routines show preservation as discipline. Food was stored, accounted for, allocated, blessed, consumed, and sometimes redistributed. But even monasteries were not immune. A spoiled store, a failed harvest, a sick herd, a damaged mill, or a disrupted supply line could trouble the most orderly house. Records from estates and religious institutions often reveal the constant accounting of grain, livestock, fish, ale, wine, cheese, and other goods. Behind those records was a simple concern: what exists now must last into the future. Writing things down was another way of fighting uncertainty. Castles, too, have to be understood beyond their stone walls. A castle under normal conditions was part residence, part administrative center, part military site, part symbol of lordship. Its stores mattered in ordinary times and became critical in siege. A siege turned spoilage into strategy. Attackers might try to cut off supplies. Defenders relied on what had been stored in advance. Grain, salted meat, dried fish, ale, wine, beans, peas, cheese, and sometimes live animals. But stored food could fail. Water could become a problem. Disease could spread. Waste accumulated. The ability to withstand a siege depended not only on walls, but on the quiet condition of food inside them. Here the problem of spoilage became military. An army on campaign faced even greater difficulty. Soldiers needed food that could travel, but travel punished food. Grain had to be carried or requisitioned. Animals could be driven with the army, but they needed grazing and slowed movement. Salted provisions helped, but they were heavy, monotonous, and dependent on supply organization. Foraging could strip the countryside and create suffering for civilians. A medieval campaign was as much a food problem as a battlefield problem. This is one of those hidden explanations that changes how we see the period. Many military decisions were shaped by supply, season, and spoilage. Armies often moved when food could be found. Campaigns could stall because provisions failed. Castles could hold out or surrender because storage had succeeded or failed months earlier. The drama of banners and armor depended on the less glamorous reality of grain sacks, barrels, livestock, mills, ovens, and carts. War had a stomach. The same was true of cities. A large medieval city could not feed itself from within its walls. It depended on hinterlands, roads, rivers, markets, mills, bakers, brewers, butchers, fishmongers, and officials. The larger the population, the more constant the flow had to be. A delay in grain supply could raise prices. A bad harvest could cause unrest. Spoiled goods could damage confidence. Urban life required trust in systems that no single household fully controlled. And because food was so central, cheating around food was taken seriously. Cellars might stretch ale, alter bread, sell old meat, hide poor-quality goods, manipulate measures, or pass off inferior items. Not every cellar did this, of course, but the temptation existed because margins were real and losses from spoilage could be painful. If a merchant's stock was beginning to fail, the pressure to sell quickly increased. Regulation, reputation, and punishment were meant to restrain that pressure. But the underlying problem remained. Once food began to decline, someone had to absorb the loss. Loss is a crucial word in this story. Spoilage was not merely disgusting. It was economic disappearance. Labor vanished. Seed vanished. Animal life vanished. Fuel and salt used in preparation vanished. Transport costs vanished. A ruined barrel of fish or spoiled grain store represented many earlier days of work. This is why people were careful and why so much medieval food culture was built around salvage. To modernize, reuse can look like desperation. In context, it was intelligence. A society with limited surplus had to rescue value wherever it could. Yet salvage had limits, and people knew it. Medieval literature, household accounts, urban regulations, and moral complaints all show concern with bad food, fraud, gluttony, scarcity, and proper order. Food was never just fuel. It was moral, social, economic, and spiritual. A rotten product sold dishonestly was not only a health risk, it was a breach of community trust. A feast during scarcity could become politically dangerous. A lord's control of mills, ovens, fishing rights, forests, or salt access could shape daily survival. Spoilage sat inside a much larger system of power. And then, beneath all these visible systems, there was the invisible world medieval people could not fully see. Bacteria, molds, yeasts, toxins, parasites, and chemical changes. They saw the effects. They smelled sourness, watched mold bloom, noticed illness, learned from patterns, and developed customs that often had practical value. But they did not have germ theory. They could not identify precisely why one batch failed and another survived, why one piece of meat sickened a household while another only tasted strong, why one damp store became dangerous. Their world was full of clues, but not full explanations. This gap between observation and explanation shaped the emotional texture of food. A medieval person could be knowledgeable and still uncertain. A cook could follow all ordinary rules and still face failure. A buyer could choose carefully and still be deceived. A household could store well and still suffer from damp. The past was not a world without expertise. It was a world where expertise had to operate without some of the hidden knowledge modern science would later provide. And that brings us toward one of the most important places in the medieval food system, the point where preservation, trade, faith, and authority met in the ordinary act of buying bread, meat, fish, and ale. Because once food left the private household and entered the market, the question was no longer only whether it would spoil, but who had the right to judge it, price it, punish it, bless it, tax it, and decide whether it was safe enough to feed a town waiting for its next meal. That waiting town lived by judgments made in very ordinary places. Beside a baker's oven, under a market awning, near the butcher's stalls, at the door of an alehouse, along the river landing where barrels were rolled, from boats, and in the narrow lanes where buyers carried food home before the day warmed. To decide whether food was safe enough was not only to use the senses. It was to enter a whole web of custom, law, reputation, and necessity. A loaf might be weighed. An ale might be tasted. Carcass might be inspected. A fish might be rejected by smell, touch, or visible decay. Yet every decision happened inside the same pressure. Food had value only if it could still be trusted. Trust was especially visible in bread. Bread was too central to be treated as an ordinary commodity. It stood at the center of the diet for many people, and because of that, it stood at the center of suspicion. A baker could cheat by making loaves too light, using poorer flour than expected, selling stale bread as fresh, or taking advantage of rising grain prices. But a baker also lived under pressure from the other side. Grain prices changed. Flour quality varied. Ovens required fuel. Dough behaved differently depending on weather, milling, and storage. The public wanted reliable bread, but the baker worked with materials that were never perfectly stable. The rules around bread therefore reveal a kind of medieval negotiation. Authorities tried to balance the cost of grain with the weight and price of the loaf. In principle, if grain became more expensive, the size of the loaf changed rather than the price rising wildly beyond reach. This was not generosity. It was social control. Bread unrest was dangerous. A community that felt cheated in its staple food could become angry quickly. The loaf, resting on a board in the market, carried the weight of politics. Spoilage entered this system quietly. Flour itself could suffer if grain had been damp or badly stored. Bread made from poor grain might be dark, heavy, sour, gritty, or more vulnerable to molding. In times of shortage, mixtures became more common, and the line between acceptable substitution and dishonest adulteration could become tense. Ordinary people knew the difference between rough food and fraud. They might accept coarse bread in hard times, but they resented being deceived. The problem was not simply that medieval food spoiled. It was that spoilage created opportunities for dishonesty, and dishonesty weakened the social trust around food. Ale had a similar public life. In many communities, ale was brewed frequently because it did not keep indefinitely. Before the widespread use of hopped beer in many regions, ale could be especially short-lived. It might sour, weaken, or vary in quality from batch to batch. Ale tasters, where they existed, were not quaint figures from a comic past. They answered a real need. People buying ale needed some assurance that it was wholesome, fairly priced, and not falsely measured. The alehouse was social, economic, and sometimes disorderly, but it was also part of the food system. The work of brewing shows again how medieval people lived between skill and uncertainty. A good brewer knew grain, water, heat, vessels, timing, and fermentation by practice. But even a good brewer faced failures. A batch could turn. A vessel could taint the drink. Warm weather could shorten its life. A customer might complain. An official might test. A reputation could be built over many successful brewings and damaged by a few poor ones. In a world where preservation depended so much on transformation, the people who managed transformation became important figures in daily life. Meat brought a sharper kind of anxiety. The butcher stall was a place where value, danger, and visibility met. Fresh meat could be desirable, but it was also one of the foods most vulnerable to rapid spoilage. The smell of a meat market, especially in warm weather, must have been powerful. Blood, offal, hides, fat, waste, animals awaiting slaughter, and meat exposed for sale created a sensory world far removed from modern wrapped cuts beneath glass and refrigeration. Medieval towns often tried to control where slaughtering happened, where waste went, and what could be sold, not because they had modern public health systems, but because the problems were obvious to anyone with a nose. A carcass revealed some things and concealed others. Visible disease, discoloration, bad odor, swelling, and decay could be noticed. But not every danger was visible. A butcher's honesty mattered. So did his knowledge. So did the speed of sale. A good piece of meat in the morning could become less certain later. Meat that could not be sold fresh might be salted, cooked, or repurposed if caught in time, but this too created temptation. At what point did practical thrift become deception? At what point did strong cooking become an attempt to disguise what should not be eaten? Medieval communities did not always answer consistently, but they understood the question. Offal and lesser cuts complicate the picture. Modern consumers sometimes imagine them as signs of poverty, but in medieval food systems, using the whole animal made practical sense. Organs, blood, fat, feet, heads, and bones could all become food or useful materials. Yet many of these parts spoiled quickly. They had to be cooked, sold, preserved, or consumed with urgency. The nose-to-tail economy was efficient, but it was not leisurely. It demanded timing. A slaughtered animal created an immediate burst of opportunity and risk. This urgency shaped work patterns. Butchery, curing, rendering, sausage-making, and cooking all had to happen in sequence. Fat could be rendered into lard or tallow. Blood could be used quickly in puddings or other preparations. Bones could flavor broth. Meat could be divided by quality and destination. In a larger household, different portions might go to different ranks of servants and diners. In a town, buyers of different means might purchase different parts. Nothing was supposed to vanish uselessly, but avoiding waste required organization, and organization required people who knew exactly what had to happen before spoilage narrowed the choices. Fish was even more unforgiving. Fresh fish close to the water could be a valued food, but inland it became a logistical achievement. Fishmongers had to think in hours, routes, weather, and preservation methods. Salted and dried fish could move through trade networks, but fresh fish needed speed. River fish, pond fish, eels, shellfish, and coastal catches each had their own rhythms. Some fish could be kept alive for a time in water, making them more reliable. Others began changing almost immediately after capture. The market inspection of fish was therefore not a minor detail. Bad fish announced itself, but sometimes too late. A fish that smelled strong might still be part of a preserved food culture. A fish that smelled wrong was another matter. Medieval buyers had to understand these distinctions, just as they understood the difference between aged cheese and spoiled cheese, sour ale and ruined ale, stale bread and moldy bread. The senses were trained by necessity. Taste and smell were not merely pleasures. They were instruments of survival. Cheese sat somewhere between fragility and durability. It could be one of the great answers to spoilage, turning perishable milk into a storable food. But cheese also required trust. A cheese might be fresh and soft, hard and aged, salted and travel-worthy, or poorly made and already failing. Its rind, texture, smell, and moisture told a story. A buyer needed experience. A seller needed reputation. A cheesemaker needed control over milk quality, temperature, salt, pressing, aging, and storage. If fresh milk was time slipping away, cheese was time reorganized, but never completely conquered. Butter was more delicate. It could be valuable, especially in regions where dairy was common, but it spoiled more easily than hard cheese and could turn rancid. Salted butter lasted better, but again required salt and care. In some places and seasons, butter was common. In others, less so. The fat economy of medieval households was regional and seasonal. Butter, lard, dripping, olive oil, nut oils, and other fats varied according to geography, status, and trade. Fats were precious because they carried calories, flavor, and cooking power. They were also vulnerable to bad storage. This may sound like a series of separate foods, but medieval people experienced them as one system. Bread needed grain, mills, ovens, fuel, and rules. Ale needed grain, water, vessels, and timing. Meat needed animals, slaughter, inspection, and preservation. Fish needed water, speed, salt, drying, or religious demand. Dairy needed animals, seasonal milk, labor, and transformation. Vegetables needed gardens, weather, storage, and cooking. Every food had its own clock, and the medieval household had to listen to all of them at once. In towns, those clocks became public. Market bells permitted selling hours, official inspections, tolls, stalls, guild customs, and market days all shaped the rhythm of freshness. A market day gathered goods, but also gathered risk. Food arriving from different places and conditions met in one crowded space. Buyers compared. Sellers hurried. Officials watched where they could. Dogs nosed at scraps. Flies gathered in warm weather. Rain turned streets filthy. Sun made perishables more urgent. The medieval market was alive, but it was not romantic. It was practical, noisy, fragrant, and unstable. Waste was part of the picture too. Food waste in a medieval town could not simply be tied in plastic bags and sent away invisibly. Bones, blood, spoiled vegetables, fish guts, ashes, dung, and dirty water had to go somewhere. Urban authorities often tried to regulate waste disposal because rotting refuse affected smell, water, movement, and health. But narrow streets and dense populations made cleanliness difficult. A butcher or fishmonger who disposed of waste badly did not only offend taste. He could anger neighbors and officials. The boundary between food supply and urban sanitation was thin. This is another reason spoilage mattered so much. Food that failed did not simply disappear. It became waste, smell, vermin, and sometimes disease. A spoiled barrel, a rotten heap of vegetables, or discarded fish remains could affect more than the owner. In closely packed streets, one person's loss became everyone's nuisance. The medieval town had to manage not only eating, but the aftermath of uneaten things. And still, despite all this, the system worked often enough to sustain growing towns, monasteries, castles, ports, and villages for centuries. This is important. If we only describe danger, we distort the past. Medieval food systems were vulnerable, but they were not incompetent. They fed millions of people across generations under conditions modern people would find exhausting. Their success depended on repetition. The same routes used again and again, the same preserving methods refined through practice, the same market rules enforced imperfectly but persistently, the same seasonal expectations shared across communities. Much of this knowledge was local. A coastal community understood fish in ways an inland village might not. A mountain community stored and ate differently from a lowland one. A Mediterranean town with access to olive oil, wine, and certain fruits had different preservation habits from a northern village built around ale, dairy, and rye. A household near salt production had different possibilities from one far away. To speak of medieval food as if it were one uniform experience is therefore misleading. The common theme was perishability. The answers varied by landscape. Climate mattered deeply. In colder regions or colder months, food could keep longer, though damp was still dangerous. In warmer climates, drying could be easier in some conditions, but heat intensified spoilage for fresh foods. Humidity complicated everything. Coastal air, marshland, dense forests, upland pastures, river valleys, and walled towns all created different storage problems. The medieval world did not have one battle against spoilage. It had thousands of local battles, each fought with the materials at hand. Seasonal scarcity also shaped taste preferences in ways modern people sometimes overlook. A strong salted fish, a sour drink, a hard bread softened in broth, an aged cheese, a smoky piece of meat, or a sharp vinegar sauce might not have been second best in every context. People developed tastes around what preservation made available. Practical foods became familiar foods. Familiar foods became cultural foods. Over time, necessity could turn into identity. This matters because it prevents us from imagining medieval people as constantly longing for modern freshness. They did value fresh foods when available, but they also valued foods we might find strong, dense, sour, salty, smoky, or coarse. The medieval palate was trained by survival, religion, status, and habit. What seems unpleasant to one age may be normal to another. What seems like hardship from a distance may have carried comfort, memory, and pleasure within its own world. Still, there were limits. When food truly spoiled, people knew. The disgust that humans feel toward decay is ancient. Medieval people complained about bad smells, bad ale, rotten meat, corrupt cellars, and foul markets. They had standards. They had preferences. They had embarrassment around serving poor food. Elite households especially cared about honor and display. A badly managed table could reflect badly on the lord, lady, steward, cook, or entire household. Food quality was social reputation made edible. The role of the steward and household officers in wealthy homes shows this clearly. Large households required accounting. What came in, what went out, what was stored, what was consumed, what was wasted, what was owed, and what was suitable for which occasion. The kitchen was not a place of random abundance. It was managed through hierarchy. The pantry, buttery, cellar, larder, bakehouse, brewhouse, and kitchen all had roles. Each space had officers or servants responsible for order. Spoilage was a failure that could reveal poor supervision. The larder, in particular, was one of the most important rooms in a large medieval household. It held meat and other provisions that had to be cool, watched, and protected. The word itself carries the memory of fat and preserved meat. A well-kept larder signaled competence. But a larder was vulnerable to heat, pests, theft, damp, and mismanagement. It was not enough to possess food. One had to govern it. The buttery, where drink was stored and served, had its own importance. Ale, beer, wine, and other drinks required careful handling. Wine could sour. Ale could deteriorate. Barrels had to be tapped, monitored, and moved. A high-status household might have imported wines and prized drinks, but these too depended on storage. A fine wine badly kept could become a costly disappointment. The wealthy could buy better goods, but they could also lose more spectacularly when those goods failed. In poorer homes, there were fewer specialized rooms, but the same principles appeared in smaller form. A chest, a shelf, a hanging basket, a pot near the hearth, a sack in a dry corner, herbs hung from rafters, meat suspended in smoke, roots buried or stored in sand, cheese wrapped and watched. These were modest versions of the same fight. The household was arranged around keeping things usable. Even small architectural choices mattered. Where the damp settled, where smoke passed, where animals could reach, where sunlight entered, where air moved. Women's labor was often central to this world. While roles varied by class, region, and household, much of the daily management of food preservation, preparation, brewing, dairying, gardening, and household storage depended heavily on women's knowledge. This was not informal in the sense of being unimportant. It was essential expertise. Knowing when milk should be turned, when ale was ready, when bread dough had risen enough, when a stored item had to be used, when a pot should be boiled again, or when a smell meant danger could shape a household's survival. Men's labor also entered through plowing, harvesting, herding, slaughtering, milling, fishing, trade, butchery, and transport. Children might gather fuel, herbs, berries, nuts, eggs, or help watch animals and carry water. Food preservation was not a single person's task. It was woven through the labor of the whole community. The meal on the table condensed fields, animals, fuel, water, tools, weather, roads, markets, laws, and hands. Because of this, food spoilage was emotionally powerful. It was not like losing a small luxury. It meant losing labor already spent. Imagine a family discovering that stored grain had gone damp, or that mice had damaged a sack, or that milk had soured too far before it could be used, or that a piece of meat saved for an important day had turned. Such losses carried frustration, worry, and sometimes shame. They reminded people how little separated order from vulnerability. At the same time, many forms of controlled souring were welcomed. This is the subtle line the medieval cook walked. Sourness in vinegar, ale, certain dairy preparations, or fermented dough could be useful and desirable. Sourness in a spoiled pot could be alarming. Mold on some aged foods might be tolerated or managed. Mold on bread might mean waste. A strong smell from cheese might be expected. A strong smell from meat might be danger. The senses had to interpret context. The same quality could mean success in one food and failure in another. This interpretive world gave rise to caution but also flexibility. Medieval recipes and household practices often rescued foods through soaking, boiling, spicing, souring, drying, or mixing. Salt fish might be soaked to draw out harshness. Stale bread might thicken sauce. Old ale might become useful in cooking or vinegar-like contexts if not truly ruined. Fat might seal cooked meat in a pot. Fruit on the edge might be stewed. These practices were not careless. They were ways of extending value while respecting limits. The modern phrase food waste often suggests abundance thrown away through neglect. In the medieval context, waste was more often a visible enemy. People did waste food, especially elites during display feasts or through poor management, but ordinary households had strong incentives to use everything possible. Leftovers did not carry the same refrigerated security they do now, so they had to be reincorporated quickly. The kitchen was a place of constant conversion. Fresh into cooked, cooked into reheated, stale into soaked, milk into cheese, grain into ale, fruit into drink, bones into broth, fat into storage. This conversion also shaped flavor. Sauces in medieval cooking were often sharp, spiced, herbed, thickened, or colored. Vinegar, wine, verjuice, mustard, onions, herbs, and spices could brighten preserved or heavy foods. In wealthier cookery, spices could signal refinement, but they also worked within a cuisine already shaped by salt, smoke, drying, and aging. Strong sauces did not simply mask decay. They made preserved foods more pleasant, digestible according to period ideas, and socially impressive. The myth of spices hiding rotten meat reduces a complex cuisine to a joke. The truth is that medieval flavor was built around the realities of preservation. There is also a deeper social meaning in freshness itself. To serve something fresh out of season, fresh after distance, or fresh in abundance could signal power. A lord with fish ponds could serve fish reliably. A monastery with gardens could supply greens and herbs. A city connected to strong trade routes could access foods others could not. A household with ice or snow storage in certain contexts, or with deep cool cellars, had advantages. Freshness was not merely taste. It was control over time, land, labor, and networks. But for most people, the greater achievement was not luxury freshness. It was avoiding hunger through the ordinary stored foods that rarely appear glamorous. Dried peas, beans, oats, barley, rye, onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, hard cheese, ale, coarse bread, salted pork, smoked fish, and pottage ingredients were the quiet backbone. Their reliability mattered more than elegance. They did not promise perfection. They promised continuance. And continuance is the key word. Medieval food systems were designed less around pleasure in the modern consumer sense and more around carrying life forward from one season to the next. Pleasure existed, certainly. Feasts, fresh bread, sweet fruits, good ale, roast meat, rich sauces, honeyed dishes, and festive foods all brought delight. But beneath delight was continuity. The best food was food that arrived, lasted, nourished, and did not betray. The fear of betrayal shaped the law, the market, the household, and even the moral language around food. A seller who passed off bad goods betrayed the buyer. A servant who mismanaged stores betrayed the household. A ruler who failed to ensure grain supply risked betraying the town. A community that ignored waste and filth betrayed its own health. Food spoilage forced people to ask who could be trusted with the fragile boundary between nourishment and harm. That boundary became especially visible during crisis years, when ordinary rules strained. If grain prices rose sharply, bakers faced suspicion. If meat became scarce, quality might fall. If fish supply was disrupted during fasting seasons, religious and economic pressures collided. If war interrupted roads, towns felt the shock in their markets. If livestock disease struck, dairy and meat systems suffered together. In such moments, spoilage was no longer just about individual foods. It exposed the dependence of society on timing, movement, and trust. Yet medieval communities did not face these pressures passively. They adapted. They stored more when they could. They diversified foods. They used common rights to gather from woods, fields, and waters where custom allowed. They preserved in multiple ways so that one failure did not destroy everything. They relied on kin, neighbors, markets, lords, monasteries, and charities in different combinations. The system could be harsh and unequal, but it was also resilient in ways built from long experience. That resilience can be seen in the humblest meal. A bowl of pottage made from stored grain, garden vegetables, a little fat, herbs, and perhaps a trace of preserved meat might seem unremarkable. But inside it was a whole strategy. Grain kept dry, vegetables grown or stored, fuel gathered, water carried, pot maintained, fire watched, ingredients judged, leftovers managed. The meal was calm only because many uncertainties had already been handled. And as the day ended in a medieval town, the food clock did not stop. Unsold goods had to be dealt with. Bread might be discounted, saved, dried, or turned toward other uses. Ale continued to change in its vessel. Meat had to be sold, salted, cooked, or removed. Fish became more urgent with every hour. Households checked what must be eaten before morning. Servants closed storage rooms. Market refuse attracted animals. Fires died down, but pots and barrels remained active in their own slow way. Night could cool the air, offering a brief reprieve, but morning would begin the judgments again. The baker would measure flour against demand. The brewer would watch the next batch. The fishmonger would hope the catch arrived in time. The butcher would face the same visible line between value and loss. Buyers would return with coins, baskets, suspicion, and need. Officials might appear or they might not. And beneath the ordinary buying and selling, the larger medieval question continued to unfold. How could a society built without refrigeration, without modern sanitation, without scientific food safety, and without reliable transport still feed itself day after day? The answer takes us beyond the market stalls and into the deeper machinery of medieval supply. The fields, mills, ovens, barns, manorial obligations, rivers, tolls, and seasonal labor that decided whether food reached the town already half lost to time, or arrived just soon enough to be eaten before the world began to take it back. That deeper machinery began in the fields, long before any loaf appeared on a baker's board or any bowl of pottage warmed beside a hearth. Medieval food was already in danger while it was still standing in the ground. Grain could lodge in storms, rot in wet weather, fail in drought, be eaten by birds, damaged by insects, choked by weeds, or harvested too early because hunger pressed harder than patience. The first fight against spoilage, then, was not in the kitchen. It was in the timing of the agricultural year. For a farming household, the calendar was not an abstract thing. It was a chain of decisions. Plowing had to happen when the soil could be worked. Sowing had to meet the right season. Harvest had to wait long enough for grain to ripen, but not so long that weather destroyed it. Hay had to be cut and dried before rain returned, because hay was not only fodder, it was winter survival for animals. If hay spoiled, animals weakened. If animals weakened, milk declined, manure declined, traction declined, and future harvests suffered. One damaged food source could echo through the entire rural system. The harvest itself was a moment of urgency that modern abundance can make difficult to imagine. A ripe field did not wait. Once grain was ready, labor had to gather quickly. Men, women, children, servants, tenants, wage laborers, and neighbors might all become part of the seasonal rush. Sickle and scythe moved through the field. Sheaves were bound. Grain was stood in shocks to dry. Carts carried it away. Every hour of dry weather mattered. A sudden rain could undo careful work. Damp sheaves could mold. Grain stored too wet could heat, sour, or decay inside the heap. A harvest was not safe when it was cut. It was safe only when it was properly dried, stored, and guarded. This is why medieval communities watched the sky with such seriousness. Weather was not background. It was a force inside every meal. A stretch of rain at the wrong time could weaken bread months later. A cold spring could delay growth. A hot, dry summer could reduce yield. A wet autumn could make storage dangerous. These conditions were not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic, but they shaped more lives. The bread eaten in winter carried the weather of the previous summer inside it. Once grain left the field, it entered the barn, and the barn was another place where time had to be managed. Threshing separated the grain from the stalk. Winnowing used air to remove chaff. Dryness remained essential. A barn had to protect against rain, but also allow enough ventilation. Too much damp invited mold. Too much exposure invited birds and animals. Floors, lofts, sacks, bins, and granaries all mattered. The building itself became part of the food system, and a poorly kept barn could ruin what the field had generously produced. Rodents and insects were constant enemies. A mouse did not need to understand the value of grain to damage a family's winter. Weevils did not arrive as a catastrophe all at once. They could work quietly through stores. Cats, traps, sealed containers, raised floors, careful sweeping, and regular inspection were all forms of defense. Yet complete protection was impossible. Some loss was expected. The question was whether loss remained tolerable or became frightening. Manorial systems added another layer. In many medieval regions, peasants did not simply harvest food and keep it all. They owed rents, labor services, tithes, or dues, depending on place and period. Grain might pass from peasant fields to lordly barns, from there to mills, markets, kitchens, or sale. The church claimed its tithe. Lords might control ovens, mills, or presses. These obligations shaped not only who ate, but how quickly food moved, who stored it, and who bore the risk when it spoiled. A peasant household might have grown grain with its own labor, but the path from field to bread could still pass through institutions of power. The mill is one of the clearest examples. Grain had to be ground before it became flour suitable for bread, pottage, or other uses. Hand mills existed, but many communities depended on watermills or windmills, which could be controlled by lords or monasteries. Milling was not merely technical. It was economic. The miller took a toll, often in grain or flour, and millers were frequently suspected of taking too much. This suspicion makes sense. Grain was life, and the transformation from grain to flour created an opportunity for loss, cheating, or contamination. A careless or dishonest miller could damage trust. A poorly maintained mill could grind badly. Damp grain could make poor flour. Flour itself spoiled more quickly than whole grain because grinding exposed more surface to air, moisture, and pests. This is a crucial detail. Milling made grain useful, but it also made it more vulnerable. Once grain became flour, the clock moved faster. So households often preferred to store grain whole and grind when needed, where possible. Whole grain held the future more securely. Flour was closer to the mouth, but also closer to decline. This created a constant balance between convenience and preservation. A baker needed flour ready. A household needed meal for cooking. But too much ground too soon could mean waste. Even in this small choice, medieval life reveals its deeper rhythm. Every transformation solved one problem while opening another. After milling came baking, and baking too was shaped by power. In some places, households used communal ovens or lord-controlled ovens, paying for the right to bake. In towns, professional bakers supplied many customers. In rural areas, baking might happen at intervals because heating an oven required fuel and effort. Bread was therefore made in batches, and each batch had to last. Freshness was temporary. The loaf began to change as soon as it cooled. Communal baking also created social contact. People brought dough, waited, watched, compared, complained, and exchanged news. But it also introduced risk. If many loaves entered the same oven, each had to be marked or remembered. A poorly managed oven could burn bread, underbake it, or bake unevenly. Underbaked bread might spoil faster. Burned bread meant loss. Fuel quality, oven heat, dough hydration, flour quality, and the baker's skill all mattered. Bread was simple only after it was finished. The Lord's oven and the Lord's mill remind us that medieval food spoilage cannot be separated from medieval authority. Control over processing meant control over time. A lord who controlled a mill controlled when and how grain became flour. A lord who controlled an oven controlled access to efficient baking. A monastery with a good mill, bakehouse, and granary could preserve and process with more discipline than a scattered household. Infrastructure was preservation. Power was partly the ability to turn fragile harvests into usable food before they failed. Rivers also mattered in this deeper machinery. A watermill depended on flowing water. Too little water and the mill slowed. Too much and it could be damaged. Freezing could interrupt work. Flooding could ruin grain near riverbanks or damage stored supplies. But rivers also carried food. Grain, wine, salt, fish, timber for barrels, and fuel could move more efficiently by water than by road. A town on a good river had access to a wider food world, but it also depended on that river's moods. Supply could be abundant one season and uncertain the next. Tolls followed movement. Bridges, roads, river crossings, ports, markets, and town gates often became places where goods were taxed or controlled. Every toll added cost. Every delay added risk. For durable goods, this might be irritating. For perishable food, it could become serious. A cart waiting at a gate in warm weather was not merely delayed. Its contents were aging. The medieval food economy was slowed not only by mud and distance, but by the rights of people who controlled passage. And yet those same systems could also create order. Markets needed rules. Bridges needed maintenance. Ports needed oversight. Mills required construction and repair. Ovens needed fuel and skilled use. Medieval authority could be exploitative, but it could also provide the infrastructure that made food movement possible. The relationship was uneasy. People resented dues when they felt unfair, but they needed the systems that turned harvest into bread, river cargo into market supply, and raw grain into daily food. At the village level, common rights could help households survive the limits of their stored food. Access to woods, pastures, meadows, marshes, and waterways allowed people to gather, graze, fish, cut fuel, collect nuts, gather berries, or feed pigs en masse where rights permitted. These resources did not solve spoilage, but they diversified the food system. A household dependent on one store was more vulnerable than one with several small sources. A few eggs, some gathered greens, a pig fattened on acorns, a handful of nuts, fish from a stream, or fuel from the woods could all reduce pressure on stored grain. Fuel, again, returns quietly to the center. Without fuel, grain could not become bread or porridge. Meat could not be boiled. Water could not be heated. Ale could not be brewed. Milk could not be processed in the same way. Food that needed cooking might become difficult to use. Fuel shortages could make food insecurity worse, even when food existed. A sack of grain is not the same as a meal. The difference is labor, water, tools, and heat. Woodland management, therefore, had a direct connection to food preservation. Coppiced wood, gathered brush, charcoal, peat, and other fuels supported cooking, baking, brewing, smoking, and drying. In places where fuel was scarce or expensive, households had to adjust what and how they cooked. Long boiling required time and fuel. Baking required concentrated heat. Smoking required controlled exposure. Preservation techniques were not chosen only by taste or tradition. They were shaped by the energy available. Medieval people also used architecture to save fuel and food. The placement of hearths, ovens, storage pits, cellars, lofts, and smoke spaces reflected generations of adjustment. A loft above a smoky hearth might help dry and protect certain foods. A cool corner could hold dairy for a little longer. A raised granary could discourage rodents and damp. A clay-lined pit could store roots if conditions were right. A thick-walled cellar could slow warmth. None of these were perfect, but together they formed a domestic technology of survival. The open-field systems found in many medieval regions created another kind of rhythm. Scattered strips, shared labor patterns, communal grazing rules, and harvest customs meant that food production was social. One family's timing affected others. Animals could not graze wherever they wished before harvest. Fields opened and closed according to custom. The stubble after harvest could become valuable grazing. Manure from animals returned fertility to the soil. Food preservation depended indirectly on these community agreements because the future harvest depended on the health of the land. Soil fertility itself mattered. A field that produced poorly gave less surplus to store, and less surplus meant less tolerance for spoilage. Manure, fallow, crop rotation, legumes in some systems, and careful use of animals all shaped how much food existed to preserve. A high yield could cover some losses. A low yield made every loss sharper. Medieval agriculture was therefore always balancing present hunger against future fertility. Eat the seed grain and survival this month might damage next year. Slaughter too many animals and winter might be easier but spring work harder. Use too much fodder and livestock suffer. Store badly and the labor of months disappears. The fragility of seed grain deserves attention. Not all grain was meant for immediate food. Some had to be saved for sowing. This grain needed to stay dry and viable. If seeds spoiled, the damage reached into the next agricultural cycle. A household or community could survive a lean period by consuming reserves, but consuming or losing seed was more dangerous. It meant the future itself had been eaten. In a world where survival depended on annual renewal, preserved seed was one of the most important forms of hope. This also explains why famine was so frightening. Famine was not simply the absence of food in the present. It could force decisions that weakened recovery. People might sell animals, consume seed, abandon tools, migrate, or take on debts. Malnutrition made labor harder, and weakened bodies were more vulnerable to disease. Spoiled stores during or after a poor harvest could deepen the crisis. Food systems were resilient when many supports remained. They became terrifying when several failed together. Yet, in ordinary years, the machinery held. Grain moved to barns. Some went to rents and tithes. Some went to mills. Flour became bread. Bran fed animals or entered coarser foods. Straw became bedding, thatch, fodder, or fuel in some contexts. Animals grazed, produced manure, milk, wool, eggs, meat, and labor. Gardens filled gaps. Markets supplied what local households lacked. Nothing was isolated. The medieval food system was a web of conversions, and spoilage was the pressure that kept the web in constant motion. Gardens are especially important because they soften dependence on stored grain. A cottage garden might provide leeks, onions, garlic, cabbages, beans, peas, herbs, and other useful plants depending on region and season. These foods were often less visible in written records than grain rents or elite feasts, but they mattered deeply in daily nutrition. They also had their own spoilage patterns. Greens had to be eaten fresh or cooked. Roots could sometimes be stored. Herbs could be dried. Legumes could be dried for later use. The garden gave freshness, but also required timing. Onions, garlic, and leeks appear humble, yet they were powerful foods in a preservation world. They added flavor to monotonous staples, could keep better than delicate greens under the right conditions, and worked in pottage, sauces, and preserved dishes. Herbs, too, were not merely decorative. They flavored food, contributed to household medicine, and helped make stored or simple foods more varied. A small garden could make preserved food feel alive again. Fruit occupied a more seasonal place. Fresh berries, cherries, plums, apples, pears, and other fruits varied by region and status. Some could be dried, stored, cooked into sauces, pressed into drinks, or preserved with honey where available. But ripe fruit was fragile. It bruised, attracted insects, fermented or rotted quickly. A fruit harvest could feel abundant for a short time and then vanish unless transformed. This gave fruit a special emotional quality, sweetness bound to urgency. Honey was one of the more remarkable preserved foods. It could keep well under the right conditions and served as a sweetener before sugar became more widely available to many regions and classes. Beekeeping also provided wax, essential for candles in religious and elite contexts. But honey, too, required labor and skill. It was valuable, not casual. Its relative durability made it precious, but access varied. A honeyed dish could express comfort, medicine, status, or celebration. Sugar, where present in later medieval elite contexts, was even more status-laden. It traveled through trade networks and remained expensive for much of the period. It could be used in medicine, confections, and elite cookery. But for most ordinary households, sweetness came more from fruit and honey when available. The story of spoilage reminds us that taste itself was shaped by supply. A modern sweet pantry would have seemed astonishing not only for its flavor, but for its shelf-stable abundance. Wine and ale show how agricultural surplus became drink through transformation. Grapes were highly seasonal, but wine could carry them forward. Barley, oats, wheat, or other grains could become ale or beer. Apples and pears could become cider and perry. These drinks were not merely ways to avoid spoilage. They were social foods, ritual foods, calories, trade goods, rents, and markers of region. But they still required storage. A bad barrel could ruin good drink. A cellar too warm, too damp, or poorly managed could damage value. Liquid preservation demanded its own architecture. Barrels themselves deserve a moment because they were one of the quiet technologies that made the medieval food world possible. A good barrel could hold wine, ale, fish, meat, butter, or other goods. Could travel. It could be stacked, rolled, loaded onto carts or ships. Coopering was skilled work. The shape of the barrel was not accidental. It was an answer to movement and storage. But wood was organic. It could leak, swell, shrink, absorb smells, harbor residues, or fail at the joints. To trust a barrel was to trust the cooper, the wood, and the handling. Sacks and cloth played their own role. Grain, flour, beans, peas, salt, spices, and other dry goods moved in sacks. But cloth did not protect perfectly from damp, theft, insects, or rough treatment. A sack might be marked, counted, weighed, stored, and reweighed. Loss could happen through spoilage, spillage, pilfering, or false measure. Medieval accounting often reflects these anxieties. Numbers in a record were not abstract. They represented food that might vanish if not guarded. Mills, ovens, barrels, sacks, barns, cellars, carts, boats, and markets together formed an infrastructure of preservation. None of it looked futuristic, but all of it was technology. The common mistake is to imagine technology only as metal machines or modern science. Medieval preservation depended on tools and systems just as surely. The mill wheel, the smokehouse, the salt pan, the granary, the cooper's barrel, the baker's oven, the monastic cellar, the fish pond, the orchard press, the cheese press, the market inspection, the harvest custom. Each one extended the life of food in a different way. But infrastructure could break. A mill damaged by flood could slow flour production. A bridge collapse could interrupt supply. A warband could burn barns. A lord's dispute could block access. A murrain among animals could reduce dairy and meat. A fire in a town could destroy stored food as well as homes. A single fire was especially frightening because so much food preservation involved dry materials. Straw, grain, wood, thatch, flour dust, dried herbs, and stored fuel. Fire could rescue food through cooking, but it could also erase a winter's security in minutes. The risk of fire shaped towns and households. Ovens, hearths, candles, rushlights, and sparks were always present. In crowded wooden or thatched environments, a kitchen accident could become a neighborhood disaster. Food storage and fire were uneasy companions. Grain needed dryness, but dry grain burned. Smoke preserved meat, but uncontrolled flame destroyed the house. The medieval household used fire every day, and every day it had to be contained. This daily containment gives us a better sense of medieval skill. The past was not simply dirty, careless, and unlucky. It was attentive. People knew the feel of dough, the smell of damp grain, the heat of an oven, the sound of a mill, the timing of brewing, the look of a good curd, the danger of a roof leak, the value of a dry sack, the urgency of slaughter season. Their world demanded competence in small things. Many of those competencies left few written traces because they were too ordinary to record. And this, perhaps, is why medieval food spoilage can teach us so much. It forces us to look at the quiet systems that allowed life to continue. Not the crown, not the battlefield, not the cathedral alone, but the barn door kept shut against rain, the millstone turning at the right pace, the loaf pulled from the oven before it burned, the salted fish packed tightly enough to last, the woman judging whether milk could still be saved, the servant checking the larder, the child sent to gather kindling, the market official smelling a suspect carcass, the boatman hoping the river stayed passable. Food reached the town only because these small acts connected. A loaf on a table was the final stage of a long defense against loss. It had survived weather, harvest, storage, milling, transport, baking, sale, and household use. It was ordinary, but its ordinariness was an achievement. And if that loaf hardened by the next day, or molded in a damp corner, it reminded everyone that the achievement was temporary. The next step in this story carries us into the more personal side of that temporary world. How people actually ate when freshness could not be assumed, how they judged the line between safe, stale, sour, strong, and spoiled, and how the medieval meal itself became a careful act of managing time before the food on the table changed once again. That personal side of the story begins at the table, though for many medieval people the word table can make the scene sound more formal than it often was. Food might be eaten from wooden bowls, trenchers, shared dishes, or simple vessels near the hearth. In richer households, meals could be structured, ranked, and ceremonial. In poorer ones, they were more practical, closer to the fire, closer to the work of the day, and closer to the uncertainty of what remained in storage. But whether the setting was a cottage, a monastery, a market inn, a townhouse, or a noble hall, the same quiet question remained. How far along was the food in its journey from freshness to loss? To eat in the medieval world was to understand stages. Bread was not simply bread. It was fresh, yesterday's bread, hard bread, bread suitable for soaking, bread fit for a trencher, bread too stale for comfort but still useful, or bread that had crossed into mold and waste. Ale was not simply ale. It was newly brewed, good and lively, weak, souring, useful for cooking, or unfit. Cheese could be young, aged, sharp, strong, dry, sweating, cracked, or spoiled. Fish could be fresh, salted, dried, soaked, oversalted, badly cured, or dangerous. Meat could be newly killed, hung for a short time, salted, smoked, boiled, potted, reheated, stretched into broth, or rejected. This knowledge was not written on labels. It lived in bodies and habits. A medieval cook, housewife, servant, monk, baker, brewer, butcher, or market buyer learned to read food through touch, smell, sight, and memory. They knew when a crust had gone too hard to chew but not too hard to save. They knew when milk could become curds and when it had gone beyond usefulness. They knew when a pot needed boiling, when a barrel smelled wrong, when damp had entered a sack, when a fly-blown piece of meat should be refused, and when a strong-smelling food was merely strong because that was its nature. Modern people often speak of spoilage as a clear line. Before the line, food is acceptable. After it, food is thrown away. In medieval life, the line was more often a zone of judgment. Some foods moved gradually from fresh to less pleasant to still useful to questionable to lost. The household tried to catch them before the final stage. This is why so much cooking was adaptive. A hard loaf could become part of soup. Salt fish could be soaked and boiled. Leftover meat could be chopped into a pottage if still sound. Fruit nearing softness could be cooked. Sour liquid could become useful in sauces. Fat could seal cooked meat beneath a protective layer. The kitchen was not only a place where food was prepared. It was a place where time was slowed, redirected, and sometimes bargained with. But medieval people were not reckless. The idea that they casually ate rotten food misunderstands both human instinct and practical reality. Rotten food was unpleasant, risky, and wasteful. People complained about it. They regulated it. They punished cellars for it. They used every sense available to avoid it. What made medieval eating different was not a lack of concern, but a lack of modern certainty. They could not chill food reliably. They could not seal it in industrial packaging. They could not always know which invisible dangers were present. They had experience, and experience was powerful, but it was not perfect. This imperfect knowledge created habits that shaped the meal. Boiling was common not because medieval people were timid cooks, but because boiling was useful. It softened hard foods, drew flavor from bones and scraps, made grains and legumes edible, reheated leftovers, blended ingredients of different ages, and reduced some risks. Pottage was therefore more than a humble dish. It was an answer to a world where foods rarely arrived in perfect modern condition. It allowed the cook to combine the fresh, the stored, the preserved, the small, the broken, and the nearly urgent into one sustaining bowl. The same was true of sauces and sharp flavors. Vinegar, verjuice, wine, mustard, herbs, onions, garlic, and spices where available helped give life to foods altered by preservation. A salted fish or smoked meat was already changed before it reached the pot. A sauce could balance harshness, brighten heaviness, and create pleasure from necessity. The medieval palate accepted intensity because the food system produced intensity. Salt, smoke, sourness, aging, drying, fermentation, and strong herbs were not strange additions to food. They were part of the structure of eating. In elite dining, these flavors could become art. A noble table might present color, aroma, texture, imported spices, elaborate sauces, and carefully timed courses. But even there, the deeper problem remained. The feast was a performance built over a fragile base. Behind the polished dishes stood cooks watching fires, servants carrying plates before heat faded, officers managing stores, buyers securing supplies, and workers preserving what could not be used immediately. A feast looked like abundance because so much labor had hidden the danger of loss. For ordinary households, the drama was quieter. A family might eat bread, ale, pottage, cheese, onions, legumes, greens, or a little preserved meat. The meal could be monotonous, but it could also be comforting. Repetition was not always a failure. In a world of uncertain supply, familiar food was reassuring. A pot that simmered reliably, bread that could be softened, ale that was sound, and grain that had kept dry meant that the household had made it through another stretch of time. Children learned these rhythms early. They saw adults check stores, cut away unusable parts, soak hard food, carry water, gather kindling, help with animals, and eat what needed eating before it failed. They learned that fresh foods came and went, that some dishes belonged to certain seasons, that special foods marked feast days, and that waste carried consequences. Food education was not a lesson delivered in words alone. It was absorbed through repetition. The smell of baking, the sourness of brewing, the smoke in the rafters, the hardness of winter bread, the relief of spring greens, the urgency of harvest. Seasons shaped not only what people ate, but how they felt about eating. In late summer and autumn, there might be a sense of fullness, with fruits, grains, slaughter, brewing, and preserving all pressing at once. In winter, preserved foods dominated. In late winter and early spring, the stored world thinned. The first fresh plants after scarcity could matter more emotionally than any rich dish at a feast. They signaled renewal. They told people that the year had turned, that animals might strengthen, that gardens might return, that the long negotiation with stored food was easing. Yet even renewal brought work. Freshness was never passive. Fresh milk had to be used. Fresh greens had to be picked and cooked. Fresh fish had to be eaten or preserved quickly. Fresh fruit had to be gathered before birds, bruising, and rot claimed it. The arrival of abundance began the race again. This circular rhythm gave medieval food its deepest pattern. Plenty became preservation, preservation became endurance, endurance became scarcity, scarcity gave way to freshness, and freshness once again had to be captured before it vanished. The line between hunger and security was therefore not simply the amount of food available on one day. It was the ability to carry food forward. This is the central truth behind medieval spoilage. A society could survive harsh seasons if it could store, preserve, transport, and distribute well enough. It could suffer badly when those systems failed. Spoilage was not only a matter of taste or smell. It was the enemy of continuity. and continuity depended on trust. People trusted the baker to provide honest bread. They trusted the brewer to sell sound ale. They trusted the butcher not to pass off unsafe meat. They trusted the miller not to steal too much grain in toll. They trusted the cooper to make barrels that held. They trusted servants to watch the larder. They trusted neighbors, kin, markets, monasteries, and local custom. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes it was broken. The entire medieval food system was held together by practical skill and social expectation, because no household could control every stage alone. This is why spoiled food had moral weight. A rotten item sold knowingly was not just bad merchandise. It was a violation of the fragile agreement by which people fed one another. A lord who demanded dues harshly during scarcity, a merchant who hoarded grain for profit, a baker who cheated weights, or a seller who hid decay all touched the same nerve. The fear that the food system itself might betray those who depended on it. In a world where food was already difficult to preserve, dishonesty made the natural problem crueler. But we should also remember the competence that usually kept life moving. It is easy, from a modern distance, to see only darkness. Mold, sour milk, bad meat, dirty streets, smoky kitchens, damp cellars. Those things were real, but so were the solutions. Medieval people built barns, mills, ovens, smokehouses, dairies, fish ponds, cellars, markets, fasting cuisines, brewing traditions, cheese-making methods, salting networks, and seasonal habits that allowed them to endure. They lived close to spoilage, but they did not surrender to it. They also found pleasure within that world. Fresh bread could be deeply satisfying precisely because it did not last. Good ale could mark fellowship. Cheese could carry the taste of a region. Herbs could brighten a winter pot. A feast day dish could lift the spirits because it interrupted monotony. Sweet fruit in its season could feel like a gift. Even preserved food could be loved, because preservation was not merely survival. It became culture. The taste of smoked meat, salted fish, sharp cheese, sour ale, or dense bread belonged to memory as much as necessity. The modern world has hidden much of this from view. Refrigerators hum quietly in the background. Trucks and ships move food across continents. Plastic, glass, cans, cold chains, preservatives, pasteurization, freezing, and food safety regulations create a sense that food can wait. It often can, at least for a while. But the medieval world reminds us that this waiting is not natural. It is an achievement. For most of human history, food was more impatient. It demanded attention, timing, labor, and respect. That may be the most important difference. Medieval people did not live in a world where food was endlessly available and silently stable. They lived in a world where every meal had a history visible behind it. Bread spoke of harvest and milling. Ale spoke of brewing and timing. Cheese spoke of milk saved from quick loss. Salt fish spoke of distant waters and preservation. Pottage spoke of thrift, fuel, gardens, leftovers, and stored grain. A meal was not a simple product. It was a successful passage through danger. And when food failed, that failure was also instructive. A moldy loaf revealed damp storage. A sour barrel revealed a brewing or keeping problem. Spoiled meat revealed delay, heat, or dishonesty. Weevilled grain revealed vulnerability in the store. Medieval people learned through these failures because they had to. Their food world was full of feedback, sometimes gentle, sometimes severe. The household that ignored it did not remain secure for long. By the end of a medieval day, after the market had closed and the hearth had quieted, the work of preservation still lingered. Pot might be covered. Bread might be wrapped or stored. Grain might be checked. Cheese might be turned. Meat might hang in smoke. Ale might rest in a vessel. The kitchen did not sleep in the modern sense. It held things in transition. Every stored food was still changing, slowly and silently, moving toward usefulness or loss. That is why medieval food spoiled so easily. Not because people were foolish, not because they lacked care, and not because their kitchens were merely chaotic. It spoiled because the world was warm, damp, alive, and difficult to seal away. It spoiled because roads were slow, containers imperfect, fuel costly, salt valuable, weather unpredictable, and science incomplete. It spoiled because every food came from living things, and living things return quickly to change when not protected. The medieval struggle was the struggle to slow that return. And perhaps that is what makes this history so quietly powerful. It takes something ordinary, bread hardening, milk souring, meat turning, fish needing salt, and reveals an entire civilization of labor behind it. The story of spoiled food is really the story of how people tried to hold time in their hands. They did it with smoke, salt, stone, wood, fire, faith, law, habit, and memory. They did it imperfectly, but often enough to build towns, feed monasteries, sustain armies, raise families, celebrate feast days, and carry life from one uncertain season into the next. So the next time we open a cupboard, close a refrigerator door, or throw away something that has lasted longer than any medieval cook could have imagined, it is worth remembering that freshness was once a brief and fragile visitor. For medieval people, food was never just food. It was weather survived, labor preserved, trust tested, and time resisted for one more day. And if one detail from this world stayed with you, I'd be curious to know which one felt hardest to imagine living with. The constant judgment of whether food was still safe, the seasonal hunger gap, the pressure of preserving meat and grain, or the simple fact that even a full pantry could still be in danger. If you enjoy these calm, deeper journeys into everyday history, you're always welcome to subscribe and return for another quietly fascinating story from the past.